In Washington, the balance of power is rarely about governance. It is about control. As the United States Senate prepared to recess for its scheduled adjournment, a fundamental institutional conflict emerged, one that speaks not just to partisan gridlock, but to the underlying erosion of procedural norms within American democracy. At the center of this dispute is President Donald Trump, now serving in his second term, growing increasingly frustrated with what he perceives as deliberate obstruction by Senate Democrats in confirming his executive branch nominees. The clash is not isolated to a disagreement over personalities. It is about the future operational capacity of the federal government and the rules that govern its composition. The standoff began when a tentative agreement reportedly negotiated between Senate Republicans, Democratic leadership, and the White House collapsed at the last moment. The framework had been designed to expedite the confirmation of Trump's stalled nominees in exchange for concessions that Senate Democrats considered vital. These included halting so-called rescission packages, a budgetary tool favored by the White House to claw back previously allocated funds, and the unfreezing of billions in spending already approved for the National Institutes of Health and for foreign assistance programs. But President Trump rejected the terms outright. On his social media platform, Truth Social, he denounced the deal as, quote, egregious and unprecedented. He accused Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and his Democratic colleagues of engaging in, quote, political extortion. In classic Trumpian fashion, he instructed Republicans to abandon the deal, return to their home states, and tell their constituents that Democrats were, in his words, bad people. The language was intentionally provocative, but it underscored a deeper dynamic. This was not merely the rejection of a legislative bargain. It was a rejection of the Senate's old-world diplomacy, where institutional memory, compromise, and precedent once guided the chamber's function. Instead, the moment revealed an accelerating departure from bipartisanship and a growing willingness by both parties to exploit procedural levers for political advantage. In response, Senator Schumer attempted to frame the collapse of negotiations as a personal defeat for the president. Holding a printed copy of Trump's own message mounted on a placard for dramatic effect, Schumer claimed that Trump had failed to intimidate or manipulate the Senate. He walked away with his tail between his legs, Schumer said, suggesting that Trump's tactics had finally met resistance. But to interpret the incident as a moment of humiliation misses the broader point. This is not about a single failed negotiation. It is about institutional decay. And more critically, it is about how American power is increasingly being shaped by personal feuds, structural dysfunction, and strategic breakdowns within its own governing system. Because while Democrats are seeking to block Trump's appointments, and Trump is using executive power to freeze funds and apply political pressure, the actual function of government is caught in limbo. This crisis of coordination is no longer an exception. It is becoming the norm. And what is unfolding inside the Senate chamber speaks to a broader geopolitical consequence. When the world's leading superpower struggles to staff its own departments, allocate its own funding, or even agree on the procedural terms of engagement, the result is a projection of weakness. And weakness, in global affairs, is always tested. As President Trump attempts to reassert executive control and push his nominees through the Senate, the deeper battle is over whether the system as constructed in the late 18th century can still perform in the 21st. Because the very idea of consensus, of cross-party negotiation, is rapidly becoming obsolete, and the consequences may extend far beyond Washington. They may determine how or whether American strategic objectives can be executed at all. This is where cold logic begins. And this is only the first crack in the surface. At its core, the modern United States Senate is no longer a deliberative body. It is a containment zone, a political arena designed less for legislation than for leverage. The standoff over President Trump's nominees is emblematic of this transformation. The traditional role of the Senate to advise and consent on presidential appointments has evolved into a battlefield where partisan strategy outweighs institutional duty. Nominees for critical roles across the federal government, including departments central to national security, economic policy, and foreign assistance, remain in procedural limbo, not because they are unqualified, but because they are politically inconvenient. Senate Democrats have mastered the art of delay. Through committee bottlenecks, procedural holds, and quorum manipulation, they have slowed the confirmation process to a crawl. Their objective is not secrecy, it is paralysis. And while their public justification rests on concerns over policy or character, the reality is that this is a calculated effort to reduce the executive's capacity to govern during a second Trump term. Yet the Republican response has been fractured. While Trump urges unilateral defiance and the abandonment of cross-party deals, some Senate Republicans remain hesitant. Moderate members, many of whom face re-election in increasingly polarized states, fear that dismantling existing Senate rules could set dangerous precedents. Once those norms are broken, they do not return. Senator John Cornyn of Texas, under pressure from the right, has signaled support for procedural reform. He, like others facing populist primary challengers, is increasingly aligning with Trump's push to modify Senate rules, enabling faster confirmations. But others are cautious. There is an underlying recognition among institutional Republicans that once the rulebook is rewritten, it can and will be used by Democrats when the balance of power shifts again. Today's advantage is tomorrow's liability. That is the dilemma. Should the Senate maintain its arcane traditions, even if they lead to systemic gridlock? Or should it modernize its procedures, knowing that such changes will empower future administrations of the opposite party? This is not simply a tactical question, it is structural. Because the legislative mechanics of the United States were not designed for partisan warfare. They were designed, in the words of the founders, to slow the process of government, to force consensus, and to avoid rash action. But those assumptions no longer hold. The age of bipartisan negotiation, of moderate Democrats and liberal Republicans, is largely gone. The ideological overlap that once made compromise possible has evaporated, and in its place is alignment. Alignment by party, not by region, not by institution, not by interest. Just party. The modern Senate now functions on an expectation of party line loyalty. Any deviation invites internal discipline, primary challenges, or, increasingly, political exile. The idea of persuading opponents across the aisle through debate, negotiation, or shared policy is now considered naive. And within that framework, obstruction is not a bug in the system. It is the system. That is why Trump's frustrations are not unique. His predecessors faced similar blockades. But Trump's response is different. Rather than working within the constraints of the Senate, he is seeking to overwhelm them by rejecting deals, freezing funds, and turning every procedural conflict into a loyalty test for Republicans. He is reshaping not only how the presidency interacts with the Senate, but how the Senate itself must defend its relevance. And at stake is the future of the American separation of powers. Because when confirmation processes are weaponized, when rules are rewritten for expedience, and when legislative deadlock becomes a permanent feature, then the operational capacity of the federal government itself begins to fail. This is no longer about personalities. It is about the survivability of institutional governance. And in a world increasingly defined by rapid geopolitical shifts, proxy conflicts, and global economic interdependence, the inability of the United States to staff its own government with speed and stability is not just a domestic liability. It is a geopolitical signal, one that adversaries will read and allies will question. And it will not be ignored. To understand the Senate's paralysis, one must return to the architecture of American governance itself. The United States Senate was never designed for speed. It was designed for stability. At its inception, the Senate was envisioned as a moderating force, a chamber insulated from the passions of the moment, slower than the House, more deliberative, and less reactive to public opinion. It was meant to act as a brake on the impulses of majoritarian democracy. For much of the 20th century, that design was functional, not flawless, but operative. Bipartisanship, though imperfect, was a practical reality. Coalitions crossed party lines. Ideology did not map neatly onto red and blue. There were liberal Republicans in the Northeast, conservative Democrats in the South, and committee chairs wielded power independent of the president's agenda. But over the past 5 decades, that balance eroded. The Southern strategy, the culture wars, the centralization of media narratives, and the rise of nationalized fundraising have gradually eliminated the space for ideological heterodoxy. Today, political identity is tribal, and party affiliation is total. Nowhere is this more visible than in the fate of the filibuster, once a procedural mechanism rarely used, now the default tactic of legislative obstruction. The filibuster was designed to ensure extended debate, to protect minority rights in a majoritarian system, and to prevent rapid legislative swings that might destabilize governance. But that function, too, has been hollowed out. In recent decades, the use of the filibuster has exploded. It is no longer a rare exception. It is the norm. And with that normalization came its political weaponization. Both parties have blamed each other for its overuse, but both have contributed to its demise. Democrats eliminated the filibuster for most executive branch appointments during the Obama administration. Republicans eliminated it for Supreme Court nominees under President Trump's first term. Each step was justified as a defensive measure. Each step was framed as necessary. But each step also deepened the erosion of institutional guardrails. What remains is a Senate no longer governed by rules of consensus, but by a calculus of power. Senators no longer seek durable agreement. They seek tactical victories, short-term leverage, and maximum control when their party holds the majority. The minority, in turn, uses every available procedural delay to slow or derail the agenda because the chamber no longer rewards cross-party cooperation. It punishes it. This dynamic has led to a political environment where even routine confirmations, judges, ambassadors, agency directors become points of existential conflict. And when presidents, including Trump, encounter resistance, they increasingly bypass the Senate altogether. They rely on acting appointments. They issue executive orders. They test the boundaries of unilateral power. This is not governance. It is adaptation. It is the executive branch learning to function in a world where the legislative branch can no longer act with unity even within its own ranks. And that has global implications, because American influence does not operate in a vacuum. Its credibility is tied to its coherence. When foreign governments see a White House unable to fill diplomatic posts, or an administration operating through temporary appointees with no Senate confirmation, they do not see strength. They see fracture, and fracture invites challenge. In international affairs, appearances are power, and a system that cannot appoint its own officials in a timely manner, that cannot execute its own budget without internal vetoes, that cannot even agree on the procedural rules to adjudicate disputes, signals not just dysfunction, it signals vulnerability. And in a geopolitical environment where rising powers are seeking to test the limits of American influence, that signal matters. It matters in Beijing. It matters in Moscow. It matters in Tehran, in Ankara, and in every capital that watches Washington, not for what it says, but for what it fails to do. Because in great power competition, legislative paralysis is not a domestic issue. It is a strategic liability. In the Trump era, the rules of engagement are no longer procedural. They are personal. President Donald Trump has long rejected the etiquette of traditional governance. He does not operate within the institutional rhythms of Washington. He disrupts them. His handling of the Senate standoff is not merely about stalled nominees or frozen funding. It is about reasserting presidential primacy in an era of fractured authority. Trump's response to the Senate impasse was not to renegotiate, not to extend an olive branch, but to detonate the agreement entirely. By labeling the Democratic proposal as political extortion, he reframed a procedural dispute as a moral confrontation. This is not the language of diplomacy. It is the language of war. And the battleground is institutional legitimacy. Trump's platform of choice, Truth Social, is not incidental. It is a deliberate bypass of traditional media and formal communication channels. Through these direct posts, he speaks not to Congress, but to his base. And by doing so, he transforms procedural disagreements into partisan litmus tests. When he instructs Republicans to reject compromise, to walk away from bipartisan talks, to tell their constituents how bad Democrats are, he is not simply maneuvering politically. He is weaponizing institutional inertia. Trump understands that the American electorate no longer judges governance by legislative outcomes, but by narrative control. In this environment, obstruction is reframed as principle. Defiance becomes loyalty, and the failure to confirm nominees becomes less about dysfunction and more about proving who is willing to fight. This strategic inversion forces Senate Republicans into a corner. To defy Trump, even on procedural grounds, is to risk alienation from their own electorate. To cooperate with Democrats is to invite accusations of betrayal. Even seasoned lawmakers, such as Senator Cornyn, now find themselves publicly aligning with Trump's agenda, not necessarily out of ideological fervor, but out of political necessity. Because in the post-loyalty age of American politics, the party line is drawn not by the party itself, but by the president, who commands its base. And the consequences of this realignment are profound. The Senate was once a body where internal dissent was common, where senators could challenge their party's president without immediate political suicide. But those days are over. Today, party cohesion is enforced not through negotiation, but through fear of electoral reprisal. Trump has mastered this ecosystem. He does not merely govern. He tests the fault lines of every institution that resists him and dares it to hold. The rejection of the Senate deal was not a tactical failure. It was a strategic demonstration. By blowing up the agreement, Trump sent a message not just to Democrats, but to Republican lawmakers who believe in compromise. The message is simple. The rules have changed. There is no neutral ground. There is no institutional buffer. You are either in or you are out. And for those within the Republican Party still clinging to the norms of old, the calculus is unforgiving. Support the president or prepare to be replaced. This internal pressure reshapes not only the personnel calculus within the federal government, but the very nature of the party itself. And that transformation carries external consequences. Because when foreign leaders assess American predictability, they are not only looking at who is in power, they are watching how that power is exercised, how it is resisted, and whether institutional checks still function. If confirmation processes can be disrupted by presidential tweets, if legislative deals collapse under pressure from the executive, if the Senate fears its own voters more than it respects its own rules, then the reliability of the United States as a geopolitical actor begins to falter. And in a world defined by alliance systems, deterrence strategies, and multilateral commitments, reliability is not optional. It is foundational. The internal mechanics of American governance are not isolated from global observation. They are studied, analyzed, and interpreted with precision. What may appear to domestic audiences as mere political squabbling is, from an international perspective, an indicator of systemic vulnerability. When the United States Senate fails to process nominations, when key foreign aid disbursements are frozen by executive order, when bipartisan agreements collapse publicly and without resolution, allies do not simply express concern. They begin to calculate risk. In diplomacy, Credibility is cumulative. It is not built by statements. It is built by consistency, by capacity, by follow-through. The United States has, for decades, cultivated a geopolitical identity based on the premise that its institutions are stable, its decisions binding, and its commitments durable. But when foreign ministries see that funding for their joint programs is suspended without warning, when ambassadors are left in acting status for years, when policy direction reverses not just between administrations but within them, the image begins to crack. And once that perception erodes, deterrence follows. For adversarial regimes, legislative paralysis is not merely a spectacle. It is a signal. It suggests that the American executive cannot act decisively, that Congress cannot coordinate effectively, and that the machinery of American statecraft is subject to internal sabotage. This matters in every strategic theater. In the Indo-Pacific, where Washington seeks to maintain maritime dominance and reassure regional allies, uncertainty over leadership appointments to the Department of Defense and the State Department undercuts confidence. A delayed nominee is not just a vacancy. It is an absence of presence. In Europe, where deterrence postures rely on unity between the executive and legislative branches, a fractured confirmation process creates gaps in military coordination and diplomatic messaging. NATO, while a multilateral alliance, still hinges on the leadership of its most powerful member, and leadership requires personnel. In the Middle East, where aid programs, intelligence cooperation, and arms agreements are highly sensitive to bureaucratic continuity, the perception of dysfunction undermines local partners who rely on American backing to resist hostile forces. And in the global South, where China has expanded its influence through infrastructure financing, strategic investments, and soft power diplomacy, Washington's inability to maintain foreign aid commitments becomes a liability. The result is a vacuum. And geopolitics does not tolerate vacuums. As other powers move to fill the space left by delayed American action, the United States loses more than influence. It loses initiative. And initiative in strategic competition is often more decisive than force. Meanwhile, American allies are forced to adapt. If they can no longer rely on timely confirmations, on predictable funding, or on bipartisan continuity in foreign affairs, then they begin to hedge. They diversify their partnerships. They sign deals with rivals. They reduce their exposure to U.S.-led initiatives. And though these shifts are rarely loud, they are consequential. A single failed confirmation hearing in Washington may seem insignificant. But in a regional capital thousands of miles away, it may mean the difference between signing a defense agreement with the United States or with China. Because every diplomatic gesture, every treaty, every strategic alignment is ultimately based on one assumption: that the government in Washington is capable of governing itself. And when that assumption falters, so does the foundation of the post-war order that the United States spent the past 8 decades building. This is not theoretical. It is happening now. And unless the U.S. Senate recovers its capacity to function, to confirm, to negotiate, to lead the global order it underpins may begin to unravel. When governance fractures, authority does not disappear. It redistributes. As the United States Senate continues to grind its own processes into deadlock, the consequence is not merely a delay in nominations or a lapse in oversight. It is a long-term reallocation of power away from elected institutions and toward unelected ones. This is already visible. Federal agencies, by necessity or by design, begin to fill the void. Acting officials step into roles without confirmation. Regulatory decisions, once subject to congressional review, are increasingly made by bureaucrats with limited accountability. Executive orders become substitutes for legislation. Courts interpret law in ways that redefine national policy without electoral mandate or democratic input. This is the slow, unglamorous erosion of institutional equilibrium. and its implications reach far beyond constitutional theory. Consider the judiciary. Every delay in confirming judges not only leaves dockets clogged and legal questions unresolved, it alters the ideological composition of the courts themselves. The Senate's inability to process nominations efficiently ensures that every available seat becomes a point of maximal conflict. Each judicial confirmation becomes a proxy war over the future of law itself. And when ideological imbalances accumulate, entire fields of jurisprudence shift, affecting civil rights, executive power, environmental regulation, corporate law, and national security doctrine. In parallel, the growth of executive discretion continues to accelerate. Presidents, not just Trump, but his predecessors, have responded to congressional inertia by expanding their unilateral action, not out of ambition alone, but out of necessity. Foreign policy, once the realm of Senate-confirmed ambassadors and carefully debated treaties, is now increasingly executed through provisional arrangements, covert operations, and provisional authorities under the National Emergencies Act or the Defense Production Act. These are not the tools of normal governance. They are instruments of workaround, and every time they are used in place of legislation, the legislative branch becomes weaker. This is not a Trump-specific phenomenon, but Trump has amplified it. His unapologetic rejection of Senate norms, his use of acting appointments, and his political litmus tests for internal party loyalty have all accelerated the shift. And as agencies take on more interpretive power, and as courts become more polarized, the electorate itself becomes more alienated. Public trust in Congress, already near historic lows, continues to deteriorate. Voters no longer see their representatives as problem solvers. They see them as placeholders engaged in procedural theater, incapable of delivering tangible outcomes. That disillusionment is not without consequence. It creates the conditions for political extremism, for populist movements that promise to bypass process altogether, for candidates who run not to legislate, but to disrupt. This trend is not confined to domestic politics. A government that cannot pass budgets on time, that cannot agree on foreign aid packages, that cannot confirm its own officials, loses its strategic agility. In crisis, speed is power. But speed requires function, and function requires process. Without it, the United States becomes reactive, not proactive, responding to global events rather than shaping them. The outcome is a form of geopolitical entropy, an erosion of strategic coherence, masked by the appearance of motion. Agencies continue to issue statements. Diplomats continue to travel. Budgets continue to be proposed. But the connective tissue of governance, the ability to move with unity, purpose, and authority is unraveling. And as other powers rise, powers with more centralized authority, fewer institutional bottlenecks, and longer strategic timelines, the comparative advantage of the American model narrows. Democracy, in theory, is adaptive, but without institutional reform, it becomes brittle. And brittleness in a superpower is instability for the world. There comes a point in the life of every institution when survival by inertia ceases to be sufficient. The United States Senate is approaching that point. It remains powerful in name, influential by reputation, but increasingly paralyzed in practice. The confirmation standoff that prompted President Trump's latest rebuke is only a symptom, not the disease. The disease is structural fatigue, a system that still follows rituals of deliberation but no longer produces outcomes consistent with the responsibilities it bears. And in a world that is accelerating geopolitically, technologically, and militarily, that kind of failure becomes intolerable. For decades, the American model derived its strength from a delicate balance between legislative input and executive execution, between judicial review and political accountability, between national power and institutional humility. But that equilibrium is fading. Today, the Senate delays what it used to decide. It performs procedure in place of policy. And it defers crisis management to the executive, not because it trusts the president, but because it no longer trusts itself. This cannot continue indefinitely. As the global system enters a period of volatility with intensifying great power competition, weaponized interdependence, and fragmenting alliance structures, Washington's internal dysfunction becomes a strategic variable. It affects how quickly the United States can respond to cyber attacks, how reliably it can staff embassies and intelligence posts, how credibly it can enforce trade agreements or security guarantees. A Senate that cannot confirm its own nominees, that cannot uphold negotiated deals within its own chamber, that fears internal backlash more than external threats, is not merely broken. It is compromised. President Trump, in rejecting the bipartisan deal, made clear that he does not view Senate tradition as sacrosanct. He views it as obsolete. And in many ways, he is correct. Because tradition without capacity becomes ceremony. And ceremony without function is weakness. Yet the path forward is not obvious. Reform carries risk. Changing Senate rules to allow faster confirmations, to bypass minority obstruction, to streamline governance, may yield short-term gains. But it also invites long-term consequences. The same tools used to accelerate today's agenda may empower tomorrow's adversaries. And so the strategic question emerges not just for Trump, not just for the Senate, but for the American system as a whole. Is it better to preserve rules that no longer work, or to rebuild the system to reflect political reality? That is the choice now confronting Washington. Preserve the architecture of a fading era, or modernize governance for a new one. Neither option is clean. Neither is safe. But one thing is clear. If the United States continues to rely on institutional habits that no longer match the speed and scale of the challenges it faces, then its role as the anchor of global order will erode. Not in a single moment, not with a single defeat, but with every nomination left unconfirmed, every budget frozen for leverage, every deal scuttled by partisan pressure. The architecture will strain and eventually collapse. Great powers do not fall only from external invasion. They fall when they no longer believe in the tools they once built to govern themselves. The Senate is not yet beyond recovery, but the window is closing, and those who would lead, whether from the White House or the Capitol, must now choose. Restore function or preside over failure. That is the cold logic of institutional survival, and the world is watching.